Can you please tell me your name and birth date?
My name is John Leslie Fairfield. I was born November 27th, 1927.
So how old are you today?
I am 89, soon to be 90.
And where were you born?
I was born in Chicago, Illinois, in Lutheran Deaconess Hospital.
And that hospital was downtown Chicago?
It was downtown on Larrabee Street. It was succeeded by Lutheran General, which is now in Des Plaines or Park Ridge.
Okay. Can you tell me your grandparents' names? Start with your father's parents.
My father's parents were Walter Burr Fairfield and Martha Melissa Goen. My mother's parents were William Isaiah Dyer and Elizabeth Garrett.
And do you know when any of your grandparents were born?
Yes, my grandfather was a furlough baby during the Civil War.
Which grandfather?
My maternal grandfather was William Isaiah Dyer was a furlough baby during the Civil War, born in 1863. His wife was born some 15 years later. My paternal grandfather was born about 1860, died in 1907. My paternal grandmother was born about 1880 and died about 1965.
Okay, and explain to people who don't know, what is a furlough baby?
He was a Confederate soldier, and they would release them in the spring to go back and put in crops that they could harvest in the fall, and that was a furlough. And of course, men and women do what they do, and a baby results in 9 months later, and that was my grandfather.
And did you know your grandparents? Did you ever meet them?
I knew 3 out of 4.
Okay, so start with the first one by name and tell me, what were they like?
William Isaiah Dyer was a very sick man when I knew him. He had diabetes, and he lived on a farm first in Chapel Hill, Tennessee, and then he bought another farm in Eagleville, Tennessee, and his death took place there, and I was there, and I knew him best by carrying out his slop jars and taking them down to the branch to empty them. My maternal grandmother was, of course, resident with him in both of those farms, and she was amazingly in that day and age, a college graduate, and for a long time a school teacher, and married. It was not a great marriage, but it did produce 3 children and endured to the end. My paternal grandfather had ankylosing spondylitis, which is a genetic disease, and spent much of his adult life in bed, and died at age 37 in 1907. My maternal grandmother had severe asthma, but still lived well into her 70s.
Okay, so tell me, which grandmother went to college?
My mother's mother went to college.
And what college did she go to?
I don't recall the name of it. It was a community college in rural Tennessee, in one of the small farm towns in Tennessee.
So this was in the 1800s?
Yes.
So this is ultra rare that a woman,
Yes.
Anybody going to college back then,
That's
but
right.
a woman.
Yes. And she, of course, insisted on my mother going to college, which she did.
Do you know anything about that? Why, how that came about that she went to college?
She had a father who valued education, was ahead of his time in the thought and his views of the roles of women, and felt that that's something she should do.
Did she ever talk about that experience, if there were any other women?
She died before I had a chance to
Okay.
have that kind of discussion with her.
Okay. Now, you said one grandfather was a farmer?
They both were farmers.
Both were farmers their whole
Yes.
life? Their whole
Yes.
adult life?
Yes.
Do you know what they farmed?
They were general subsistence farmers, corn and wheat, and grazed some cattle, perhaps milked some cows.
And where were each of your grandparents born?
The maternal grandparents were born in Middle Tennessee, Rutherford County, Tennessee, near Murfreesboro. My paternal grandparents were in eastern Tennessee, near Newport, which is not far from Knoxville.
So all four grandparents came from Tennessee.
Correct.
Do you know where their parents were from?
Yes, they were from Tennessee as well. I can trace the lineage back to, in the case of the first John Fairfield came to Wenham, Massachusetts in 1636.
From where?
From Wenham, England.
Wenham, England.
And the maternal grandfather came to Richmond, Virginia in about 1700.
So your family goes way, way back as far as being
Way
in the
back,
United
but that's
States.
typical of Southerners.
Right.
They settled and stayed.
And anything else you remember about your grandparents? Any experiences you had with them?
Well, as I say, emptying the slop jar, I remember. But my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, who lived the longest and I knew the best, lived on the Eagleville farm. And the Eagleville farm was virtually in an 1850 condition. No electricity, it was before TVA, no running water. And the only convenience we had was a gasoline-powered Maytag washing machine. My job was to carry 14 10-quart buckets of water up from the spring on wash days for washing and rinsing. My grandmother made the soap that we used, and she made the soap from scratch by burning an ash tree and making lye and using that with hog fat to make soap. And so it was that primitive a existence. We bathed in good nights out in the yard, pouring water on each other. In cold nights, we had to bathe out of the tank from adjacent to the wood-burning stove. So I lived the 1800s for the first few years of my life.
Wow, wow, wow. Any other stories you remember?
And I loved it.
Anything else you remember about your grandparents? Were they strict? Were they funny? What kinds of people were they?
No, I think they were pretty sober people, yes. And my maternal grandmother, who knew me the longest, always thought that my parents were spoiling me. I thought quite the opposite.
That's funny. And how did your grandparents die? Was it all natural?
It was all natural, yes.
Okay. And when did the last one die? How old were you?
I was about 14, I think.
Okay, so you have pretty good memories of your grandparents.
Of my grandmother, my maternal
Grandmother.
grandmother, yes.
What about your parents? Tell me their names.
My father was Leslie Robinson Fairfield. My mother was Frances Elizabeth Dyer. And my mother, as I said, went to Tennessee College for Women.
Well, let's go way earlier back than that. When were your parents born?
My mother was born September 20th, 1901. My father was born August 14th, 1900.
And they were both born in Tennessee?
Both born in Tennessee, yes.
Okay. Do you know how they met?
Yes, I started to say that my mother went to Tennessee College for Women. Leslie's sister, Minnie, went to Tennessee College for Women. They became best friends. Minnie, incidentally, set the world's women's high jump record at one point. But they became very good friends. Upon college, my mother went back to East Tennessee with Minnie, where they both taught school for a number of years. And of course, she met Leslie and ultimately married Leslie.
Describe your parents. What did they look like?
My mother was a very pretty young woman, and she maintained very attractive features throughout her life, but she gained weight, and that marred her beauty, but she was always a very attractive woman. My father was a very handsome man, but unfortunately, at age 19, he contracted ankylosing spondylitis, which was improperly treated and wound up causing him to be frozen in a sitting position as the joints hardened. He spent the rest of his life bent as if he was in a sitting position, and he would walk with a cane. He walked enormous amounts of time to get to Chicago streetcars and so on, but I'm getting ahead of myself. He knew that the construction work and farming that he had been doing as a youngster was beyond him, so he took an extension course at LaSalle University, Correspondence University, and got an accounting degree, such as it was, and then decided that there was no market for it, and he and my mother came to Chicago, where his older brother was an engineer for Western Electric. He found a job with a man who had a accounting and tax practice for a set of retail clients. In less than a year, the man died, and my father made a buyout arrangement with the widow, took over the practice, and built it over the years into a very prosperous practice. And he was a very well-to-do man by the time he died.
Okay, let's go back when they were younger. What were your parents like? Who was the strict one? Or did they have a sense of humor?
My mother was the strict one. In our times on the farm when I was bad, she would make me go to the peach tree and cut off a switch so that she could switch me with it.
Describe to kids who don't know what that is, what is a switch?
Well, it's a very flexible piece of wood, not hard, but it hurts like being hit with a whip. And so she'd give me 8 or 10 cracks with the switch, but the indignity of it was I had to cut it.
So you had to go find the
I had to go
switch,
find the switch,
and then she would hit you on your
and
rear
if
end.
she didn't like the switch, I had to go get another one. So she was very much a disciplinarian. My father was a very soft touch. So I would always try to maneuver so I got him to make the decision rather than her.
What else about their personalities do you remember?
Well, my mother was, in fact, they were both gregarious people, but different social sets. My father had a social set that was largely client-based. My mother was, she was president of the Lloyd School PTA where I went, and then became president of, I believe, the Illinois Parent Teachers Association, and went to conventions. And she was almost a politician. My father was a wise business counselor, and in the retail business, he had a very heavy proportion of Jewish clients, and he looked Jewish. He had Roman nose, and very often he'd be mistaken for Jewish, but he was absolutely without prejudice of any sort, and built, as I say, just a marvelous practice.
Do you know if your parents had any interests or hobbies?
My mother always wanted to be a doctor, and when she went to college, that's what she wanted to study, but her father said, that's no work for a woman. You be a teacher, a librarian, things that women do. So she wanted to go to college, and she settled for it. But all her life, she was interested in things medical, and eventually, when my younger brother went off to school, became totally or largely independent. She went back and wanted to become an RN, but she was 50 years old at that point, and they would not admit her for training, so she became an LPN, and then wound up going to Bethany Hospital in the geriatrics floor. Before she was through there, she was head of the geriatrics floor with RNs reporting to her, even though she was an LPN.
Wow.
So, medicine, and she spoke German, she taught Latin, she had learned Spanish in her adulthood. She at 36 was ashamed of herself that she had never learned to swim, so she went over to the local park and took a course of swimming and became an excellent swimmer. She was just an accomplished woman.
And your father, any interests or hobbies?
Work. He really loved work. He loved the people he worked with, but he tried to be a father to me as much as he could with his limitations. He'd take me to baseball games. He would come, we'd play vacant lot baseball. He'd come and watch kids play baseball. And he was, but as far as hobbies like coin collecting or that sort of thing, no, he did not have.
Okay, now you had mentioned your father had this disease. Now this was at 19, he was already in that bent over position?
Yes, at 19 he was normal, but he was doing a construction of a silo. There was a plank across the top that they used to communicate from one side to the other. He was walking the plank. Somebody did a prank and tried to jiggle a plank, and he fell off and fell 20, 30 feet, broke both hips, was put into a sitting cast, and a simultaneous onset of ankylosing spondylitis set in and froze him in that sitting position.
So that must have been incredibly difficult for him.
But that's a hereditary disease. His father had it. My double first cousin had it, has it, and so it was a terrible blow to him, but he survived it.
Did he ever talk about or complain about it?
Never complained about it. He did talk about it a little bit. In his last year, when he was dying of an undiagnosed cancer, I was trying very hard to get background to see if there was some way I could help to figure out what was wrong with him. And so we would talk in detail about it then, but prior to that, no, never.
And what would he say about it? Did he talk about how difficult it was to get through life?
Oh, no, he never complained about that. It was, but he was dependent until automated transmissions came on after World War II. He was dependent on the Chicago streetcar system, and if you may remember, they had open platforms with very high steps, and he couldn't get his legs up those steps. And instead, he had a massive upper body. He'd reach up and take the two parallel bars and pull himself up onto the platform and go out into the car that way. Just an amazingly strong man.
Now, why do you say until automatic cars came in?
Well, after, there were so many people who had leg problems that they started marketing cars that were totally hand operated, hand accelerator, hand brake, and so on. He got one of those, learned to drive that, and then got another car and realized that he could operate the foot brake and the accelerator, but he still needed the automated assists and so on they had. So, but that technology had to come along before he could drive.
And explain to people who don't know, what is a streetcar?
It's something that runs on steel rails in the middle of the street. You can still see the steel rails in the middle of Chicago Avenue as you cross Michigan.
So it was like a train rail car.
Yes.
That you get on. Do you remember how much it cost to take a ride?
7 cents for an adult, 3 cents for a child.
Did your parents belong to any groups or clubs?
My father became a Freemason and then eventually became a Shriner and had a fez, would go to the Shriners Parade, wear his fez and stand by the curb and watch the parade happen. Of course, he was involved in the charitable activities that they did and also the secret ceremonies that took place in the lodges.
And your mother, any groups or clubs?
Well, as I mentioned, PTA.
Right.
Oh, and my mother was a daughter of the American Revolution. And in 1939, Marian Anderson, a African-American singer, beautiful voice, was invited to sing in Washington at the Daughter of the American Revolution Hall. And they, when they found out that she was black, refused to admit the performance. My mother resigned her DAR relationship. My grandchildren now, two of them, are interested in becoming DAR, and had she not resigned, they could just slide right in, but now they have to go back through the whole they recognize that my grandmother did qualify, but since she resigned, all of that doesn't count, they have to requalify.
Now, that's the second instance you mentioned of your parents being very non-prejudice, non-judgmental. They're from the South. That wasn't exactly the most common way to be. What do you think made them that way?
I think life experience. My grandmother, one thing I remember about her was that at harvest time, you'd get people from all over the neighborhood to come in and work, and part of your obligation was to feed them lunch. And so the custom was that the white hands would come in and eat with the family in the dining room, and the black ones would eat under the tree. And my grandmother couldn't help but remark that the white ones were telling dirty jokes and laughing and loud, and out under the tree they were saying a prayer before lunch and talking very carefully, and she said, we just have the wrong set of attitudes here.
Did they ever, when your parents raised you, did they give you other lessons about not being prejudiced and things like that?
They did, but they also, I also felt the background of prejudice, and I inherited some of that I had to throw off in senior life or in mature life. It was, everything's a mixed bag. It's
right.
You're a product of your total environment, not just your parents.
What qualities do you think you have because of each one of your parents?
That's interesting. I told a story that I don't think you have about a scrimmage. I was playing high school football, and we scrimmaged against a rival team, Taft High School, just practice, but live practice. And their good running back came over my position. I managed to grab his jersey and the top of his football pants, hung on, and he dragged me 30 yards before I got him down. And the Taft coach said to me, if you had the talent that you have, tenacity, you'd be All-American on anybody's team. I think that's a metaphor for my life. I don't know how much talent I had, but I sure did have tenacity.
And do you think you got that from your father, your mother, or both?
I think my father and my mother. I think they both were very tenacious people, very hardworking, very dedicated people, yes.
Any other qualities from either one of them?
I would hope charitableness. I do believe in charity, in many ways.
Were your go ahead. Were you finished?
No, that's.
Were your parents proud of you?
Oh yes, very proud. Unfortunately, they held me up to my younger brother as a beacon that he ought to pursue, and that caused not good relationships between the two of us. It was an error in parenting on their part.
Okay, so let's get to that, because my next question was, do you have any siblings?
Only a brother who was born to my mother at age 39. I was born at 27, so about roughly 13 years difference.
So he was 13 years younger?
Younger, yes.
Okay, and what's his name?
Clark Dexter Fairfield.
And do you remember his birth date?
October 14th, 1940 was when he was born.
Okay, so you were 13 years old when he was born.
Yeah, well, almost 13.
Almost 13.
Yes.
And what was that like? How did that change the dynamic? of
Well,
the
I was
family?
very excited about it for a while. It was a very great event, and I played with him, and it was very cute. But then all of a sudden I started realizing I was no longer the center of attention, the center of the universe anymore. And so I think I got understandably jealous, and my father was so proud, I think, of fathering a son at age 40, that I think he tilted to Clark, and I was dismayed by that, and so all of that caused a lifelong tension. But Clark unfortunately got Parkinson's, severe Parkinson's at age 33 and died of it at age 60. And in his latter years, he was destitute, and I was his support, and which I think he resented that. He resented the fact that I was supporting him, and he resented the fact I wasn't supporting him in the style which he'd like to be supported. It was a very complex relationship.
What was Clark like as a little boy?
He was very smart, but not very dedicated. He didn't apply himself as he should have. But he was very smart.
Did you guys get along when you were kids?
Sometimes.
Sometimes.
Yeah, but my father again spoiled him. He bought him a boat, bought him a hot rod, and spent a lot of money on him, which kind of frosted me. I never had that kind of money spent on me.
So did you guys get along at all, or was it all fighting,
Yes,
or
we
just
got
a
along. Oh
mixture?
yes, no, we had a civil relationship. Sometimes a warm relationship, but it was up and down.
And besides the disease, what happened? Did he get married? Did he have kids?
Yes, he got married, but he never had a child, and became very dependent upon his wife. We called her Saint Judy. She was working so hard. He was squandering and pursuing dalliances outside the marriage. And he's a very good-looking man, in spite of his disease. And,
What did he do for a living?
well, he had two careers. One, he got a Chicken Delight franchise, ran a store for a while, and that didn't go so well. And then he trained himself as a pest control. Got a franchise of pest control, and ran that until his health just deteriorated to the point he couldn't do it anymore.
So is that what created the financial problem, his health?
Yes, his health, yes. And Judy just got fed up with him. He was, his dalliances got more and more frequent, and more egregious. She finally divorced him. And I helped with the divorce because they were going to lose everything during the course of his disease if we couldn't get them separated and get him on Medicaid. So I facilitate that with her, and it was an ugly time.
And how did your parents handle when he got the disease?
Well, they were. My father didn't see very much of it. He died in 1968, at 68, and so that Clark. I'm not even sure Clark's disease had set in by that time. But my mother was very concerned about trying to find remedies and causes and so on, and tried to apply all her medical knowledge and all the people that she knew, and worked very hard but very unsuccessfully in averting a continual deterioration of the disease.
And when did he pass away? What year?
He was 2000. Now there's a date I have forgotten. He was 65, so it would be 2005.
Okay. And your father, you said, passed away in 1968?
Yes.
How did he pass away?
Well, he had, turns out, metastasized cancer on his spine, but it was metastasized from his lungs, and so the primary cancer was the lung cancer, and he never smoked. So my mother put it down to the coal-laden atmosphere of the Loop that he spent so many years in, and the Loop used to be a very dirty place.
Loop, you mean by downtown Chicago?
Downtown Chicago, yes.
And when did your mother pass away?
She was 84, so that would have been about 84, 85.
1984.
Yeah.
Okay. How did she pass away?
She had a stroke at 78, I believe, and just gradually declined. She made a good recovery from the stroke, but then set in a gradual decline and passed away, natural causes.
What kind of marriage do you think your parents had?
It was a good marriage. My father had an eye for the ladies, and that was an aggravation. And he actually, in spite of his condition, he apparently had a little success with the ladies. And but she would threaten to leave and then come back, and and it wound up being very warm at the end. And he was very apologetic in the final days for his behavior.
Did your mother ever start dating or remarry after that?
No, nothing.
What is your single earliest memory as a child? What's the very first thing you can remember?
Well, I told Jeff a story about my first train ride, and I got confused as I passed the coal-fired locomotive, thinking that I was going to have to ride in the coal tender with all those flames coming out and so on. And so I was terrified by that. But as I think about it, thought about it some more, my mother had another brother who was the oldest brother, who got meningitis as a child and had a very terrible childhood and adulthood, lived age 34, and was mentally and physically challenged. And at age 34 fell into a roaring fireplace and was burned to death. And that was on April 15th, 1930, when I was 2.5 years old. And I went back from Chicago to Chapel Hill, Tennessee, where this happened. And it was my first experience with death, and they explained to me about, well, he's in heaven, and he's with the angels. What are angels? They have wings. And then I had a nightmare with my father in his sitting posture and pink wings flying out a window on the way to heaven. And I was just terrified by it. And I think that was probably my earliest memory.
How old were you?
2.5.
Were you there when this happened?
I would have come down for the funeral and
Okay.
had to have it explained to me. I'm not sure the terrible circumstances were explained, but death had to be explained to me. I had never encountered death before.
When you were born, where was the first place they brought you back to? Where was the first home?
4700 something Cullerton, which is just north of 22nd Street, and it's almost into Cicero, close to Western Electric,
This is in Chicago.
in Chicago.
Okay. And first of all, your parents were both born in Tennessee.
Yes,
And how did they end up in Chicago?
because my father's brother, Uncle Burr, was an engineer for Western Electric, and he encouraged them to come to Chicago, the land of opportunity.
Got it. And do you know what year that was?
1926.
Okay. So your first house was 4,700,
Yes, I've been by it. It's a two-flat.
two flat.
Yes,
And
they were renters.
what floor were you on?
I don't know that.
Okay. How long were you in that apartment?
Until I was about age 5.
Okay. Do you remember it at all?
Yes, I have memories of
How
it.
many bedrooms?
I don't know.
What
And I don't-
what do you remember about it?
I remember that there was a park with a huge wire fence and a lagoon in it nearby, and there was a soprano opera singer lived down the street that was very kind to me, and for some reason my mother took in a foster child for a while, Billy, and I sort of had a little brother, Billy, and I remember him very fondly.
How long was he with you?
Oh, a few months, I would think.
Okay. Was that the only time they fostered a child?
That's all, I believe so.
Okay. So at 5 years old, where did you move?
I moved to 2230 North LaPorte on the northwest side, roughly Belden, just west of Cicero.
And was that an apartment?
Yes, it was an apartment. It was a 4-flat, and we had the 5th flat, which was an English basement, and it was windows above ground, but it was a basement apartment. We were there for about 5 years, and moved across the street to 2247 North LaPorte, which was a bungalow. And there
Okay, before we get to that one, let's go back to that second apartment.
All
You're
right.
in the English basement. Any air conditioning?
No,
Any refrigerator?
yes,
Did have a refrigerator.
yes. Well, I suspect it had an icebox.
Okay, so describe to kids who don't know what that is, what is an icebox?
Well, it was a insulated box with a compartment on top where you put in a block of ice, and then it had shelves below that because cold drops, and you put your food in there and closed the doors, and it kept it cool. So every day or every couple of days, you'd put a sign in the window. It said ice, and depending on which direction you put it in, it said, I want 1, 2, or 3 blocks of ice. And of course, it was a great time when the horse-drawn ice wagons came through the street. We'd chase after them on summer days and pull pieces of ice off the truck and off the wagon and suck on them. And right behind them came the horse-drawn milkman, who would take off carrying a case of 4 or 5 bottles, make 2 or 3 stops, and the horse would follow along behind and stop where he dropped his last bottle out of the container, and he'd come back and supply again. It was a very romantic and very neat system.
Glass bottles, right?
Glass bottles, yes, and if they left them on your doorstep in the wintertime, they were not homogenized milk. They were pure milk, and the cream came to the top, and then it would freeze and push the paper cap clear out of the bottle, and you'd have about 1.5 inches of frozen cream sticking out of the bottle.
Do you remember the first school?
Yes, there was the only grade school, Henry Demarest Lloyd School, and I was 60 years old before I ever realized who Henry Demarest Lloyd was.
And who was he?
He was a political figure in the late 1800s, very social conscious political figure.
And how far was school from your apartment?
About 2 blocks.
So you walk to school
blocks.
every day.
I walked back at lunch, had lunch at home.
What would your mother make you?
Usually a ham sandwich on silver cup bread. I wanted silver cup because they sponsored the Lone Ranger.
Was that your favorite TV show?
That wasn't TV, that was radio.
Oh, this is on radio at the time.
Yes.
Okay, on radio.
What was TV?
Yeah, right.
That was a decade in the future.
Do you remember? Well, let's talk about radio. How did people listen to the radio back then?
It was best if you turned out the lights, particularly shows like Inner Sanctum, which is a mystery show and so on. But you would, in dark or semi-dark, your imagination would take over, and you'd get better scenes than you would get on television. It was just a wonderful entertainment vehicle. And I remember as a small child, I felt that I couldn't understand the electrical function and the sound waves and so on. I thought there were people inside that it was a 3-foot high console radio, so I'd get behind and peek in trying to find the people that were there.
And so would the whole family sit around?
Well, depending on what the show was, yes, it was Walter Winchell or Bob Hope or Fibber McGee and Molly. Very often the family would sit around.
And sit around and actually look at the radio.
I guess we did look. We did look at the radio, yeah.
Right.
And as my father got more prosperous, we bought a radio with a remote control.
Wow.
And it had a dial on it. You could dial the channels, the stations that you wanted. And we also were more prosperous, and we had an African American man who would come once a week and do housework for us. And my father loved to tease. And so when Lawson was working in the dining room where the radio was, my father, I guess, already had it turned on, and he switched the station. And Lawson was so surprised, and then he switched it again.
Do you remember when you got the first TV?
Yes, my mother got, by this, it was after we were after my first marriage. And my mother, we lived upstairs with my mother at that point, my mother and father. And so they got a TV. And so we would go down and watch that. It was Friday Night Fights, were just a big event. We'd get corned beef and rye bread and watch Davy Moore as one of the heroes, I think. Somehow or other, fighting was a great entertainment for women as well. Now you couldn't pay somebody, my wife at least, to watch a fight. But and there were other show of shows. Sid Caesar's show was just marvelous, and so we would come down and watch that, those kinds of things. And then my first wife's father got a TV and took pity on us not having one and bought us one. So we had our own, and that I think my mother was very disappointed because we didn't come down as often.
Okay, so let's go back to grade school. Did you have any friends that you remained friends with through your life from grade school?
I don't know a single person that I went to grade school with. I
Okay.
remember many people, but I've not been good at long-term friendships.
And what about, did you have a favorite subject in grade school?
No, history and geography probably.
And what about in grade school, after the school day ended, what did you do? Did you play with friends? Did you work?
Played baseball as a up until 9 years old or so, and 9 or maybe 10. and I was getting a quarter a week in allowance, and that didn't quite stretch. So I decided to get a paper route, and I delivered the Chicago Daily News and some foreign language papers, 80 copies altogether, 6 days a week, for $6 a month. So that was better than 25 cents a week, but I still I got the idea I was being underpaid. So I went to the Chicago Times at that point, before the Sun-Times, and I got a route there that I think I did 70 papers, but it was 7 days a week, and I had to collect from my customers, which wasn't true at the Daily News. And if I lost customers, I had to go out and sell enough to keep my route up to the right size, or even grow the route. And for that, I got $13 a month, so I felt like I was really in riches.
And the Daily News was a third Chicago newspaper at the time, right?
Third, and there was a fourth, the Herald and the Examiner, of the Hearst paper.
And I believe there were 2 editions a day. Did you deliver in the morning or the afternoon?
The Daily News was a afternoon paper. The Times was also an afternoon paper, but it delivered on Sunday morning as well.
Got it. And you said you played baseball. Did you play in a field? Did you play in the street?
Oh, there was a wonderful time of vacant lots, and we had a big double vacant lot on the corner, and we used that as our baseball field. And it was so much better than Little League, because as kids we had to make up the rules, we had to choose up the sides, we had to negotiate the interpretations of was he out or wasn't he out, and you were learning life's lessons there, without an adult being present.
What about religion? How were you raised religiously?
Casually. My mother was raised a Southern Baptist and hated it, and left it just as soon as she could. And so she would expose me to, I went to Lutheran Sunday school for a while, a Congregational Sunday school, and that was about it. Not very seriously.
What about your father?
My father was more indifferent than that. He was also raised a Southern Baptist and didn't buy it.
What about the religious makeup of the neighborhood you grew up in?
Oh, it was predominantly Catholic. There were components there was an Italian section, a Polish section, and a German section. Germans tended to be Lutheran, and a lot of Irish. So the Irish, Polish, and Italian were all focused on St. Genevieve, the local the local parish.
And any religious infighting, any problems?
No, it was more ethnic infighting. We used to fight the Poles for possession of the baseball field and an organized baseball field in Black Hawk Park, and it was midway between our respective ghettos to over-dramatize the divide.
And when you said you fought them, did you physically fight them?
Well, we physically did, yeah. It was, or you'd show up with greater numbers. That would help. But once in a while, it got down to really fighting.
Did your parents celebrate the holidays in the home?
Oh, yes. Thanksgiving and Christmas were very important.
And describe
Easter was all right. It was not a big holiday, but we did celebrate it.
Describe Christmas morning to me.
Well, I can remember believing in Santa Claus, and that was a very great excitement, coming down and really believing that he'd come down a chimney even though we didn't have one. And very greatly surprised with the things that were brought. It was a very wonderful tradition.
Do you remember any of the presents your parents gave you?
A sled I can remember. At 3 years old, I got a doll, I think, Susie, and I managed to pull the arm off of her eventually, I think. But a sled and maybe some board games. And, I don't remember the present so much as just the joy of getting it, and the surprise, and so on.
Did you have a Christmas dinner?
Oh, yes. Usually ham or turkey.
And would your mother do the cooking?
Oh, yes, always. She was a wonderful cook.
Other family members come?
Yes, the Uncle Burr and Aunt Ann from LaGrange, the Western Electric man, would come. We had another cousin, my father's cousin married Bill Edelman, a Jew. We had a hardware store on North Avenue, and they would come. And then another cousin who was a sister of Annie Edelman would come. So we'd have a big assemblage many times.
You mentioned your mother was a very good cook. Anything special she made that was your favorite?
Oh, my favorite I'd love to have today is steak and rice.
Steak and rice?
She'd get a good-sized T-bone steak and broil it medium rare, and she would leave the drippings in the pan and then pour canned mushrooms in on top of that, and then cook rice. And she'd take the mushroom gravy, she would call it, which is just grease and mushrooms, and pour it over the rice. And I can't imagine anything worse for my cholesterol. But boy, was it good. And when I know I'm eating my final meal, that's what it's going to be.
And you said she boiled the steak?
Broiled.
Right.
Boiled medium rare, yeah.
Did your father ever have a car?
Post-World War II, he did, yes. My father and my mother both had cars.
What kind of car do you remember?
Well, our first car, which my mother drove, was a used 1938 Plymouth, which I think we bought in 1940. And we drove that through the war. And then the first car subsequent was a Oldsmobile, I think a 46 Oldsmobile, that you had to pay black market prices. It was so, you'd say how much off a list. We were saying how much over list.
Now, why was that?
Because everybody wanted a car. They hadn't, new cars had not been produced since essentially 1940, and this is 46.
Because of the war effort.
Because of the war, yes. And everybody needed a car, and they just couldn't produce them fast enough, and therefore the marketplace took over, and you got a premium if you could sell a car.
Did you ever go to camp?
No, I was scheduled for one, and for some reason it didn't materialize. But I had the farm years. I went back to the farm every summer. That was better than camp anyway.
So where was the farm?
Eagleville, Tennessee.
And who was there? Your grandparents?
My Uncle John, my mother's brother, and my Aunt Min, my father's sister.
And when you say you went there, did you go by yourself?
Many times, yes.
For the whole summer?
Yes.
And why was that? Why did your parents send you there for the summer?
Because I wanted to go. I'd get on a train. They'd take me down to, I think, Dearborn Station, put me on the CNEI and in a day coach, and I'd ride all night. And I'd get to, I believe, to Murfreesboro, and Uncle John would meet me and take me to the farm.
And at what age did this start?
I think about 9.
And how many years did you do that?
Oh, maybe 5 years or so.
And what did you do there?
I would work the farm. I'd have to go out and drive up the cows for milking. I actually, when I was 10, 11, 12, would plow with, it was mule power, and I'd plow the garden with a double shovel plow, and just fun stuff.
Was it hard work?
Oh yes, very hard work.
So why did you like it?
Because I felt like I was being a man. It was what Uncle John did, and he was my surrogate father. He taught me how to throw a baseball and would catch me, and he actually taught me to throw a curveball. And I idolized him, and what he did, I wanted to do. I thought I'd be a farmer.
And what else during the day besides farming, or on the weekends? What else did you do down there during the summer?
Oh, there were, we called them branches, little creeks, and we could sometimes go fishing, very often go frogging. What you do is get down in the creek and find a hole under the water, put your hand way up in the hole, and try to pull a frog out. You might pull a snake out. It was crazy. I don't know why we did it. But we'd catch a frog once in a while, pull a frog, and take them home and have them for dinner.
Oh, you would eat them?
Yeah.
Interesting. So you did that for a few years. After grade school, what's the next school? Was it a junior high, or did you go right to
No,
high
I went
school?
to four-year high school at Wooden G. Foreman High School.
Foreman High School?
Yes.
How far was that from your home at the time?
Well, we had moved from the LaPorte address to Berto and Portage Park, which was in the Schurz district, and we did that the summer that I graduated from grade school. And so I did not report the fact that I changed address, and I went to Foreman, where all my friends were going. And I stayed there for 2 years before they discovered I was out of district, and they decided to let me go, let me stay. I finished.
Now, how far was this from your home at the time?
It was a bus ride. It was probably a 2-mile walk.
So it's a city bus?
Yes, a city bus.
Okay. And how did you do in high school?
I was one below the middle of my high school class because I was a real goof off. Somewhere in there, maybe it's in your questions, towards the end of high school, we were about to invade Japan, and I didn't want to invade Japan. Didn't want to be part of that party. So I tried to get into the various air forces, and I wound up taking the Naval Aviation V-5 pilot.
All right, well, we'll get to that in a second.
We'll
Let's stay in high school.
All right.
Did you have any friends in high school that you remained friends with later?
Yes, but they died.
Anybody you want to mention that you were friends with for a long time?
Russell Pease was a friend for a long time. I can't think of anybody else offhand.
Any favorite teachers that had an influence on you?
The teacher that I hated the most, I admire the most today, Clara Lewin, an old German algebra teacher. And she drilled algebra into you. And I subsequently made my living using a lot of stuff that she taught me.
So you didn't like it at the time, but you realized later?
Yes, I realized, well, what a great thing she did for me.
Interesting. In high school, what did you do after the school day?
I played football, tried to play football, and but I worked a great deal. And at age 15, remember this, in World War II, everybody was in the military or in war industry. Everybody had a job, and help was terribly scarce. So I went down to the Fair store, on one of the big department stores on State Street at that time. And I was 15, I lied and said I was 16, which is the legal age. And they put me into the commissary for the big buffet they had in the basement. I did well there, so they promoted me to the stock room. I did well there, they promoted me to running the stationary stock room. And somehow or other that got real busy. They needed to sign someone else, and they signed a 60-year-old man, and I was a superintendent at 15 or 16 years old. And they took my picture and did a cardboard cutout of it and put it in the State Street window advertising how great it was to work for the Fair store.
Do you remember what you were paid?
Yeah, I remember I was paid minimum wage at the Fair store, 40 cents an hour. And I think I finally got up to 50, 55 cents an hour or something like that.
When you say you played football, with the guys or for the high school?
No, for the high school.
And what position did you play?
I was a guard, and I played both ways in those days.
And how were you on the team the whole time?
I was on the team for 2 years. My junior year, I was quite good, but I weighed 217 pounds. I weigh 153 today, so it tells you how much bigger I was. And and I could push people around, and I was good. But then I found out girls didn't like fat guys. So I spent the summer taking off 40 pounds or so, maybe 50.
So you played freshman and sophomore years?
No, junior.
Oh,
Junior and senior.
junior and senior years.
Yeah. Well, I was on the fry soft team too, but that was just cannon fodder for the varsity team. And so I was much lighter and not nearly as good my senior year.
So you graduate high school in what year?
February 46.
So do you remember the day Pearl Harbor was attacked? Can you tell me about it?
Yes, I remember it very well. I did go to a movie at the Bell Park Theater, Belmont and Cicero. Got on a Cicero streetcar to go home, and there were people on the front platform talking about the Japs and very agitated. I asked someone what happened, and they told me about the bombing that morning, and I was very excited, and I wouldn't say jubilant, but maybe satisfied. You asked about what my father and I shared. I'd forgotten, but he was a very great newspaper reader, and I was too, and we talked current events an awful lot. So I remember very well Neville Chamberlain surrendering Czechoslovakia and the September 1st invasion of Poland and Dunkirk and all of that, and knew that inevitably we were going to be in the war, and I just felt, well, it's too bad it happened this way, but probably for the best. I don't think I ever expressed that thought before this moment, but that was the way I felt about it.
So at the time when the war started, you were not even in high school yet? Or
No,
freshman?
I was not in high school yet.
Okay, so you weren't worried about being drafted yet? You weren't of that age yet?
No. Although I thought it would be a long war and I might be in it.
And how did things change? Do you remember what changed in your world because we were now at war?
Oh, everything changed. Gasoline was rationed, food was rationed, shoes were rationed. People, everybody got a job. Tremendous labor shortages. I wanted to be, at one point, a gas station attendant at the Sears and Roebuck gas station. I had to get clearance from the War Labor Board that I didn't have essential skills at age 16 that the war effort needed. It was things were that tight, and so it just went from night and day. We had day to night. We had scrap drives. Everybody was taking up newspapers and cans and any kind of tin, because we lost Southeast Asia, our source of tin. Any toothpaste, at that point, toothpaste came in a tin tube. So the whole world changed.
Do you remember when the war ended?
Oh, yes.
Describe that day to me.
Well, the war ended twice. VE Day, which was a very big, victorious day.
So that's victory in Europe.
Victory in Europe, yes. And I can remember going downtown. That was May of '45. Going downtown where all the celebration was, and people were throwing buckets of water out of the top of the Palmer House into the street, and people would get doused, and they didn't care, and everybody was kissing everybody. You could get to kiss some nice girls, and it was very jubilant. But then, of course, we got back to the seriousness of we have to defeat Japan. And we had the terrible slaughter first on Iwo Jima, and then we were in Okinawa, and it was proving to be even more bloody. And that was all leading up to the idea that we were going to invade the main islands of Japan. And by this time, I was approaching draft age. This was mid-45, and in November of 45, I was going to register for the draft, and they took you within a week of registering. And so I just didn't want to register for the draft because I didn't want to invade Japan. So I, first of all, did qualify for the Army Air Force pilot training, but just the weekend that I was supposed to report and go to Keystone Field, I got a telegram saying, never mind, we've got enough pilots. So then I went to a much more difficult V5 Naval Aviation pilot program, and I took that, and I had no problem with the physical. I was squeaked by on the eye exam. And then I came to the 3-hour mental exam, which is supposed to cut everybody out. And it was a very tough exam. And when we were waiting for the grades, someone said, what's the best that's been done on this exam? And the petty officer said, well, we had an officer come in and take it, and he got 165. And that's an approximate number. And so everybody would nod, and then we got our exams, and I found out that I had passed. And one of the other petty officers came by and whispered to me, he said, you got 169. This was a guy that was one below the middle of his high school class. That test had been running for 6 months, and I purportedly scored the highest ever. So that says how inattentive I was in high school.
So then, what did you do? The war ends.
Well, this is while the war was still going on, and then they dropped the bomb, and that changed everything. And so we got instructions, instead of reporting for, you started with engineering training, accelerated engineering training, and I would have started in September of 45. Instead, they said, go on back and finish high school, and we'll start you at Stevens Institute of Technology in February 1st, 45. And that's what I did. And then Congress cut the appropriation significantly for the program. So they came back, and we had a 4-year and 8-month commitment. They said, that's no good anymore. You got to sign on for 8 years if you want to stay in the program. And I just didn't want to dedicate that much of my life to it. And so I said, no, I'll take general service. And then the problem was, how do I stay in long enough to become draft exempt and get GI Bill? So that's another story.
So what did you end up doing in the Army?
In the Navy. I was assigned to the post office, and they would work 6 days a week, passing out mail to guys that would come through.
And how long did that last?
Well, it lasted probably 7 months. But all this time they were trying to discharge me. And I didn't want to be discharged because I was still eligible for the draft for the occupation armies. And so I first volunteered to go with the Prince Eugen, a captured German battleship, to Eniwetok Atoll to destroy it with a nuclear bomb in a test. And I knew that with the bureaucracy in the Navy, it'd take them a long time to figure out I didn't have any skills. And it did. It took a couple of months. But I still it was premature for me to get out. So Admiral Byrd was going to the South Pole, so I volunteered to go with him. It took him another 2 or 3 months to figure out I didn't have any skills. And by that time, it was okay. I could get out, and draft deferred, and 4 years of GI Bill to go through college.
Okay, so you graduate high school in 46,
Yes.
and where did you go to college?
Well, colleges, of course, were just swamped with people. And so I wanted to go to the University of Illinois Champaign, but I couldn't get in there. But they'd opened a extension university at Galesburg, Illinois. So I was enrolled there, and for a year and a half, and it was the best college experience I had. It was maybe 1,000 students there, and you didn't get lost in the milieu, and the teachers cared. And so in a year and a half, I was transferred down to Urbana-Champaign, and I did another year and a half there. I got through in 3 years by taking a very heavy course load and some summer school, all because I wanted to hurry up and get married.
So did you do any dating in college?
No, I was, while I was on leave in the Navy, I met Adelaide Dennis, my first wife. And
Okay, so tell me, where did you meet her?
well, I'd known her for several years in high school. She was 2 years behind me. But then my final girlfriend before her was Lois Deutscher, and I thought she was my girlfriend, and I had bought circus tickets. I was going to take her Saturday night to the circus. I went to see her on Friday, say, "Hello, honey, I'm back." And she said, "Oh, I've got a new boyfriend, and I can't go with you to the circus." And so I was leaving her house, and I got again off the bus and saw Adelaide walking down the street. And I talked to her and exchanged pleasantries, and then said, "How would you like to go to the circus tomorrow night?" She said, "Good." And we had a great time, and I was anxious to get back to Great Lakes and start dating her. And I dated her consistently through college and went on most weekends to see her.
So you dated for all 3 of those years?
Yes. Yes.
And then what happened? When did you get engaged?
Oh, probably in my final year of college, we got engaged, and then I went to work. I graduated in January, went to work January 31st, I think, and we set the date for May 13th, 1950.
And where was that first job?
At Illinois Range Company in Mount Prospect, a commercial kitchen manufacturer.
And what were you making? Do you remember?
Yes, $65 a week, which netted down to $56.22 a week after income tax and Social Security.
So you get married on May
13th.
May 13th.
50.
And where did you get married?
At St. Peter's Church. But it had to be in the rectory because I was not Catholic.
So this was in Chicago.
Yes.
So you got married. Did you go on a honeymoon?
Yes, went to the Great Smoky Mountains.
And you come back, and where do you start living?
By that, my parents had bought a 2-flat in Portage Park. They had a tenant who moved out about the time we got married. So we wound up renting at $75 a month, the same rent that the tenant paid, and lived there for a couple of years.
Okay. And did you have any children with her?
Yes, 3 children with her.
Okay. So how was she working?
She was working till she got pregnant, got very pregnant. She worked for Scott Forsman, book publishing, educational publisher.
Okay. And you're still at that first job?
I was still at the Illinois Range,
Okay.
yes.
And your first child was born when?
April 8th, 1951.
And who was that?
That was Jeffrey.
And who was next?
My daughter Patricia, who was born May 14th, 1953. And then my son John Dennis, who was born September 14th, 1955.
Okay, and what was that like when you first started having children? How was life different?
Well, you took on a whole new set of responsibilities and a pretty sober uh, attitude about those responsibilities. But I wanted children, and so I just thought that was part of life's cycle.
And what were they like as little kids? Go through each one. What was Jeffrey like?
Jeffrey had a lot of problems with allergies. He had eczema, and then he got eventually asthma, and he was a very difficult first-year child. Difficult for him and difficult for his parents.
And Patricia?
Patricia, we can't remember hardly what happened with Patricia. She just kind of slid through life.
And John?
John was, he was an easy baby. He got to be a pretty headstrong youngster. Jeff and Patty, when they went to school, were just star pupils. They were ahead of their class, and Patty would go to a teacher that Jeff had had and say, "Oh, I can't wait to teach you." And so Patty would outperform Jeff. And then John would come along, and the teacher would say, "Well, I had your brother and sister, and they were just terrific. I can't wait." And he got so sick of hearing that, he said, "I'm just not going to compete with that." And he just kind of loafed through school. And I was not sure he'd even get through high school. He was so resentful of all that. And but Jeff persuaded him finally to go to the University of Rochester, where Jeff was going, and he did. And he had a so-so first year. Then he took off with his girlfriend, took a year off, and traveled the country. And by that time, I was in the process of divorcing, and he wanted to take another year off, and I said, "Well, my divorce decree says that I pay for your college up until your planned graduation date, and no further. And if you don't make your planned graduation date, you don't get any money." So he went back to school. He got a great teacher who turned him into a communist for a while, but that was all right. But he then just became a marvelous student, and today he's a professor of urban history and one of the leading lights in that field in the country.
Now, was that true about the divorce agreement, or were you just trying to motivate him?
No, it was true.
Okay.
I don't know that I would have
Right.
been that tough in enforcing it, but that it was there.
And how did the three kids get along as kids?
Like three kids would, but Jeff and Johnny were pretty good together. And Patty went her own way, but they are really loving individuals now. I'm so proud of what Adelaide and I did in raising children.
And so go through each child, what they ended up doing. You mentioned the college, but mention, jobs, marriage, kids.
Well, Jeff went to the University of Rochester, as I mentioned. He had an outstanding record, and he applied, at my urging, he applied to most of the Ivy League schools, and Rochester as a backup. And I remember we were vacationing in Myrtle Beach, and somebody forwarded the acceptance letters to us, and he opened them, and they were all rejections. He went to the other, we had two rooms, and he said, "I want to go to the other room." He came out with the saddest face, and he said, "I've been rejected by all of them." Said they all have the same story, that they're under terrible pressure to change the racial complexion of the student body, and unfortunately, this is the year we're doing it. Any other year you would have gotten in. And then subsequent to that, he says it's the luckiest thing that ever happened to him because he was a star at Rochester. He would have been just another guy at one of the big Ivy League schools. John, as I say, was questioned whether he'd even go to college. He hated school so much. Jeff talked him into it. He did wind up becoming a very star pupil, stayed on, got a PhD, and then applied for a university professorship in a field where you're not supposed to be able to get a job. And he got the first one he applied for at Xavier University in Cincinnati. And he's still there, and as I say, he's an authority in his field. He travels internationally with it. It's very accomplished. Daughter Patty was a star all the way through. Applied to Radcliffe, among others, Barnard, and Swarthmore. And I said, my firm was going through a tough time, and I said, you better get an economic backup too. Apply to Rutgers. I said, oh, I can't do Rutgers, but I'll do the University of Massachusetts. The only rejection she got was the University of Massachusetts. And I think they just figured she wasn't serious. And she got accepted at Radcliffe, and told them she turned them down in favor of Swarthmore. They couldn't believe it. But she went to Swarthmore, got out, and with a degree in history and literature, got a job with Harper and Row at that time, I think. And she was paid so little she was eligible for food stamps.
Oh my God!
And but she had a associate editor for Sylvia Plath, which is a great woman's poet. So it was a cream job, but that's how poorly publishing paid. And she did that for a couple of years, and then finally she called me and said, I wanted to become an editor to do something for literature, and said, I realize that editors can't do anything for literature, vice presidents can. I want to go to business school. And I said, good, I'll back you on that. And so she applied to Columbia, got into business school there, and they said, well, if you would, instead of business school, we see that you had a teacher undergraduate degree, or teacher minor. How about going into the PhD program instead, and we'll give you a free ride all the way? And she said, no, I won't. I want that MBA. He said, if you'll give me an MBA and a PhD, I'll do it. And they did the deal, and she did them both. And then went to work for City University of New York, where she met her husband. They both, after a couple of years there, decided they just couldn't stay in New York living. They moved to Washington, D.C. She became a professor at Georgetown. He became a professor, or they were both assistant professors or whatever, non-tenured professors. He at George Washington. It turned out he did not get tenure, and she did. She became the breadwinner in the family, but he's deceased now, but most wonderful man, a most wonderful parent. Patty has been a star on the Georgetown faculty, and had enough time left over that she ran a proprietary short fund for Morgan Stanley in her spare time, and made a lot of money that way. So she's been a real star.
And what was her husband's name? Patty and...
We'll come back.
It'll come back to you. So go Jeffrey and John. Did they get married? Did they have jobs? Tell me about that.
Yes. Jeffrey went to work for a single proprietor lawyer in in Fairfax, Virginia, and decided that that's what he liked to do, and he wanted to be a single proprietor. And he also wanted to go into politics. He'd been a Democrat all his life, and he so, but he decided that. So he did decide to run for Virginia House of Delegates from Fairfax, Virginia. And by this time I was married to Ruth, and we came out and campaigned for him. We knocked on doors for days and then worked the polling places all election day, and wound up his being declared the winner at the end of election day. And then we went through the celebration, the victory speeches and so on, went back to our hotel and got a call from his wife who said, Jeff can't talk to you, but there was a missing precinct, and he lost by 87 votes.
Oh my God.
And it was just awful. One of the worst nights I've ever lived through. So but he tried again the following 2 years. We went back through the same thing, but he was a Democrat running in a Republican district,
right.
and it didn't work. And so he gave up that idea, but he's been involved in politics now in Herndon, Virginia, still in Fairfax County, and but not in the elective part. He's had enough of that.
And what about John?
John married a woman who was a French literature major and who was teaching at
Her name?
Mary McPartland.
Did you give me Jeff's wife's name?
Cindy.
Okay.
Cindy.
And Patricia, do you remember her husband's name now?
No, not yet.
Okay, go ahead. John?
Yeah. I feel terrible.
I know, believe me, it happens. It
Yeah,
happens.
okay. I'm sorry, John married Mary McPartland, who McPartland's a famous musical name, jazz name, and she's of that family. And she was a teacher of French literature, but she started having babies in very rapid succession and wound up having a girl, a boy, and 2 more girls. And that kind of occupied her time, still does, as a helicopter mom, visiting them all over the country. Where are we?
John, you were talking about John, what
Yeah.
jobs he had, and he got married.
Well, yes. Well, he immediately applied to Xavier. Thomas is
Patricia's husband.
Thomas Verghese is Patricia's husband's name. Oh, I'm so ashamed of myself. He's just a wonderful man. Everybody loved Thomas. But John applied to Xavier, where he still is, and has created a wonderful career for himself.
Okay, let's go back, because you had mentioned your second wife. When did you get divorced?
I left as soon as John left for college. I long planned to do that. And so that was in 1973, 1973.
How long had you been married?
23 years.
Okay, so you got divorced.
Well, no, we didn't divorce until 76.
So what took so long, or what happened?
Oh, just, I had a lot of tax issues. I was making a lot of money, and with a lot of tax. And we were still in the 70% tax rate. And it helped me very much split income with her. I was paying her a lot of money at the same time. And so it was more convenient not to divorce. And she didn't care. She wasn't trying to go anyplace, and I wasn't either. And so in 75, I met Ruth, and she still had children in high school.
Ruth's last name?
Ruth, her maiden name was Trilling, and her married name when I met her was Robinson.
Okay, so where did you meet her?
I met her at a Council on Foreign Relations singles event in Orchestra Hall in Chicago.
Now, you said she was married.
She had been married.
Oh, she had been
She was
married.
divorced
Okay.
several years
Okay.
at that point.
So you met her at this meeting.
Yes, and I was there almost against my will. Two of my friends wanted to go, and there's so much rejection in those single meetings that I just didn't want to face up to it. As a matter of fact, that evening I started working the wallflowers because there's no rejection, there's only gratitude there. And strangely enough, they all had good-looking girlfriends you eventually met, and well, on a very friendly note. But I still wasn't enjoying the evening. About 9 o'clock, I decided that I would leave, and I started walking for the Orchestra Hall steps. And coming up the steps was a statuesque woman with her head up and her shoulders back, and beautiful posture, beautiful figure. And I thought, not yet, I got to meet this woman. And some guy moved in front of me to talk to her, and I looked at him.
Watch your hands on the microphone.
Oh, I looked at him and said, "He's too soft for her. He won't make the grade." And so, sure enough, a very short conversation. And she started over for the bar, and I followed her. And in retrospect, I suspected she was Jewish. She knew, and I didn't care. She knew I was Gentile, and she did care. She'd been taught all her life, you marry within your kind.
Right.
And so she was determined not to meet me. And she kept her back to me, and somehow or other, I said something to her, which neither one of us can recall, but she thought, this guy has something to say that I ought to listen to. And so we stopped and we talked, and I said, after a while, I said, I'd really like to take you home. So I never go home with someone I just met. And I said, well, this is different. I said, here's my business card. I'm a partner in Arthur Anderson. The girlfriends you came with can certainly take care of each other. Show this to them. You leave it with them. You'll know who you're with. And so it happened that one of her girlfriends was divorcing an Arthur Anderson partner. It said, you really ought to get to know him. So I did take her ahead. I took her home. I picked up her daughter on the way. Who was staying someplace, and I'd just gotten back from Egypt, and we had a nice talk about what Egypt was all about, and so on. And we had a very nice courtship for several years till January 11th, 1978, when we got married.
How many kids did she have, or does she?
She had two children.
What are their names?
Donald is Donald Lyle Robinson, and Laura Robinson.
And how old were they at the time?
Laura was 15, and Donald would have been 17.
Okay.
Yeah.
And how you got married in 1978, and your kids were, between like 13 and 16. Your kids were kind of in the same age as her kids, right?
Oh, no. My kids were adults at that point.
Oh, your kids were adults. I'm sorry.
Yeah, you remember I didn't leave until
Oh, right.
John went to college. So he was still in college at
Okay.
that point, but the others were out of college.
And how did all the kids feel about this? Was everybody okay?
Well, they had great concern about it. Yes, it was. But Ruth has a very winning personality, and very quickly put them at comfort. And it's been a love fest. We now say we have 5 children. We're treating them equally in the estate planning, and they get along with each other. They visit each other when they're in town, and so it's been just wonderful relationship.
Okay, tell me the Ray Kroc story.
Well, I mentioned I worked for Illinois Range, which is a kitchen equipment manufacturer, and within a month of my joining as I guess it called associate accountant or something, the controller got caught up in some dubious transactions and was fired. And all of a sudden I was controller and chief financial officer, and I have performed in that role until the mid-50s. And I had many hats that I wore at that point. One of them was credit manager. And the sales manager brought in this unknown guy who had built a hamburger stand in Des Plaines, Illinois, who wanted to build another one in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And the guy who had equipped Des Plaines had tried to pay him a bribe, and he was so incensed he fired him and said he'll never equip another one. He came and wanted to place a $50,000 order or whatever it took to equip a stand at that point. And so I looked at his financials, looked for net worth, and he didn't have any. In fact, he had a big negative net worth, and I said, we can't take this risk. It's too big a risk. And the sales manager appealed to the CEO, and I got overruled. And of course, it was Ray Kroc, but I got overruled on the basis that I would do a weekly audit of McDonald's books and world headquarters, which was an upstairs bedroom of a Georgian house in the best section of Arlington Heights. And I met his wife.
Unbelievable.
And then I would take him out to, or he would take me out to see customers where we would have some credit involvement as well. And so I got, after over a couple of months, I got to know him pretty well. He's a remarkable man. And somewhere I did a section on roads untraveled. That was one of them. I could have gotten on a McDonald's for $6,000, and as some of my now friends did, parlayed them into 10 or 20 of them and be multimillionaires. And so there's a road untraveled that I might have been.
Wow.
But there were others.
Tell me, in 1957, you changed jobs?
Yes, I had gone. I was really number two man at that point in Illinois Range. I did everything else except be CEO, and I could never get that job because it was family owned, and there were plenty of people in line that wanted the job, and I was tired of what I was doing. There's nothing more boring than the monthly accounting cycle, which I had to contend with. And so I happened to get a reference to Pete Marwick and Mitchell. I talked to them. They were very pleased with my background, my attainments. They needed someone in Los Angeles. I was hired, except I had to go to their psychologist. And I was so unsophisticated, I thought you told the truth to a psychologist. And I admitted my self-doubts about, did I oversell myself? And I was honest engine with them. And of course, I now realize that's the last thing you want to be. So I got a letter saying, you're not good. You're extremely intelligent, but we don't think you're cut out for a career in consulting. And I took that as a challenge. I said, I'm going to prove you're wrong. And so I wrote to the rest of the Big Eight, and I got several interviews, and one of them was with Arthur Anderson, and got hired, and wound up reporting to Anderson the same day my replacement reported to Illinois Range Company. Good luck for me, because I would have been out of a job.
Right. So 1962, Bell and Howell, tell me about that.
Yes, Bell and Howell was a 50-year-old company at that point, and they were big in the institutional movie projection business. That was a big business with them, but they also were big in the hobby movie camera business, and at that point it was essentially a wind-up spring-driven camera. And they'd been selling those for 50 years, always thinking, well, this is going to catch on like still photography will, and we're going to be doing big volumes. But it never materialized until the mid-50s. And then all of a sudden, volumes just exploded, and they said, it's finally happened. They built a $2 million square foot plant to accommodate all of this. The Japanese started coming into the market, so they built a small plant in Japan to try to experiment with that market, and nothing worked. And they were just they were losing money because they didn't have the volume anymore to sell to cover the overhead that they had taken on. And they had two sides, marketing saying, our costs are too high, we just got to move all production to Japan, get a low-cost base, and then we will be able to compete. Marketing saying, you can't sell, you couldn't sell this camera in with a Japanese label on it, it just wouldn't sell at all. You've got to find a diversified product line to absorb some of this excess capacity. And so they were stuck, and this Charles Percy, who was later Senator Percy, was chairman, and Peter G. Peterson, who's great fame in the financial markets, and Secretary of Commerce, was then CEO. And so they engaged us to try to resolve the dilemma. Well, I went to Japan, looked at what was going on there, both in their operation and in competitors and other entities, came back and interviewed extensively both sides of the argument, and finally realized all the factors that were involved, from what's the sales price impact of made in Japan to how much is having a 50% Japanese partner going to cost us, to a number of other issues, import duties and so on. And I got all the factors, and I did a series of simultaneous equations, really not much more than high school algebra, but I threw in a couple of sigma signs to make it look like rocket science. And I explained it all and said, well, yeah, that's a good description. Both sides agree that's a good description. If you could solve that, you would have the answer, but how are you going to get the values? And I said, well, we'll work on that. And so I went to manufacturing, and I said, now how much would it cost in price reduction to have made in Japan? And they said, oh, it'll cut the price in half or some ridiculous thing. And marketing's answer was hardly at all. And so we went factor by factor getting those things, and then got two sides in the room, and Pete Peterson joined us many times, and we would argue to a compromise. And finally we'd get a compromise on each one of the values. Then I plugged it into the equation, and they were going to save $400,000. I made a presentation to their board, and they had one of the board members was from Las Vegas, and he said, I can get a better odds of that in a casino. and so then Peterson said, well, what should we do? And I said, well, I've gone tool by tool through this plant, and it's a photography plant. That's all it will ever make. Forget toothbrushes and microprocessors. And he said, well, Polaroid was in here just a few weeks ago wanting us to produce the Swinger model for them, to outsource it to us, and we turned them down. Said, should we get them back? And I said, this afternoon if you can. That's exactly what you need. They did that. They diversified into now information management lines that they're in. It saved the company. And I just feel like of all the things I did, I'm proudest of that every time I hear the name Bell and Howell.
Okay, so Mickey Mantle was one of the great baseball players of all time. You have a story about him?
Yes, I do. It has to do, again, with the Bell and Howell job, the time we spent in Tokyo. We did get weekends off, and one of the things we did was to go to the Tokyo Tower, which is really just a giant TV antenna going 50, 60 stories in the air, affording a great 360-degree view of Tokyo. So we went to the top of that, did the total viewing, and as we were leaving to go down the elevator, 30 school children came pouring off the elevator, and at that point, 1963, there were only about 2,000 Americans in Tokyo, so we were a great oddity, and they started the little English that they had saying important person, movie star, and then someone said, pointed at me, and I was 35 years old and redheaded at that point, pointed at me and said, Mickey Mantle. And the other kids started saying, Mickey Mantle, Mickey Mantle. And I kept saying, no, no. And they all had autograph books, and they kept shoving autograph books at me, and I was saying no, and finally I figured, well, what the heck? And I signed Mickey Mantle maybe 20 times, and I often think about some old Japanese guy now showing his grandchildren the Mickey Mantle signature that he has.
That's funny. That's funny. Tell me about, did you do any traveling with your kids?
Oh yes, we as children, the one way that I traveled so much and worked so hard, the one way I was sure that I would stay in touch with my children is to spend our vacations on long auto trips. So we would, the longest one was to the West Coast, to Grand Canyon, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and back through Salt Lake. And Jeff was showing me a diary that we kept day by day of that last night. And by the time we had gotten back to Salt Lake, 3/4 of the way through, we'd still spent less than $1,000.
Wow.
And we were keeping track of cash and credit card. So
Wow.
that's the difference in the price scales.
So did you do mostly car travel trips?
Yes, car travel.
Did you do any traveling with your parents?
Well, yes, the Tennessee, back and forth many
Back and
times, but I did do Florida in 1939 or 1940, and I think I did 2 successive years in Florida with them, but I don't think of any other trips that I did with them.
And with your kids, ever any plane travel trips?
Oh yes, we went to New Orleans one year by plane. That's the only one that comes to mind. It's mostly automobile.
Did you do any traveling after your kids grew up with your second wife?
Enormous amounts of traveling. I had, in management, I had the great good fortune of going to management meetings all over the world, and very often wives were invited to attend, and so we would met several times in Madrid. We met in Milan. We met in Paris. We met in London, and so those were very good. And then we did domestic management meetings as well, all the big cities of the United States. But then I had a number of offices in the U.S. and in Europe that I had responsibility for, and so I would visit them and try to incorporate some vacation days when I could, and invite Ruth to come with me, and so we would see that. So, and the nice thing about that is that we were virtually royalty. in those management meetings. One that I recall was, our world headquarters was in Geneva, so we'd have meetings there, and we chartered a yacht for the management group of maybe 25 or so, and wives, for a tour of Lake Geneva, and then we landed in a small city in Lake Geneva, and they had rolled out a red carpet on the wharf, up the town street, up to a castle, into the castle where we had just a sumptuous dinner, and with horns welcoming us on the way. I just felt like we were royalty. Another night, this was in a trade association meeting. We were guests at Versailles, and we had cocktails on the veranda at Versailles with the people in period costumes serving us. Then they had a trumpet fanfare to summon us to dinner in the Orangerie. And again, beautiful carpentry and beautiful parades. We wound up with Ruth and I at a table with totally French speakers, and a few of them were American speakers, and the whole conversation, the whole evening, was by the American speakers to us. It was, and it was just an elegant dinner, and we knew that our transportation was not coming till 1 o'clock in the morning, and it was a little before midnight, and we wondered, well, what on earth are we going to do? They took us back out in the gardens, and they turned on the fountains with Handel's water music, and they had a beautiful water show. And as soon as that was over, the fireworks started with the Royal Fireworks Suite being played. Royalty. It's you feel guilty but you feel very good.
So how long were you with Arthur Andersen?
33 years.
33 years. When did you retire?
By contractual agreement, in 1990. Our firm, and I think most firms at that point, had contracts that partners had to retire at a given age to make room for those that are coming up. And so I had to retire at age 62, June 30th after my 62nd birthday.
And what have you been doing since?
Well, I consulted on my own for a while. I had a pretty good practice in how to run a consulting business. It is a business. It isn't just the knowledge you have, but there's a whole process that you have to go through if you want to be successful and make money. So I consulted at that. I also happened to be engaged by a charitable entity, the Cradle Adoption Agency, who had fallen on very hard times for a number of reasons. Part of it was birth control and the declining stigma of unmarried birth, all of those things. But most of it was just bad management. And so I was engaged to consult with them as to what to do, and I wound up giving them a very hard prescription, starting with the fact that the board was exclusively adoptive couples. And I point out to them that a couple gives one gift. If you had two individuals, there'd be two gifts. So you need to change that policy. Beyond that, you need to fire the executive director, who was in the meeting. I didn't put it quite that way, but that was clear what the message was. And I've laid out a whole lot of other things that, of course, they fortunately had a very large endowment. And I said, at the end, I said, it's a very hard thing that I'm proposing to do. I said, I think the odds are probably against your doing it, and you probably would be wise to take this endowment, find a good merger partner, and put it to a use that you feel good about but if you want to try it, I will help you. And to this day, when I see some of those original board members, they say, you said we couldn't do it. And they're the leading agency in the United States again.
So how long have you and Ruth been married?
Nearly 40 years.
40 years.
It'll be 40 years in January.
Any activities you like to do together?
Well, yeah. We were very avid skiers for a long time. And we were both hurt. And and we skied after we were hurt. But she eventually felt she didn't want to take the risk anymore. And so I went on skiing with another friend of mine for some years. And then he decided he wouldn't take the risk anymore, and I ran out of partners, so I finally had to give up.
So when was that? What age did you stop skiing?
72, I think. But the more remarkable thing is the age I started skiing. We had a weekend place across the lake in the snow belt, and we would cross-country ski a lot, and for several years. And I finally said, Ruth, the part of this I like best is when we go downhill. Why don't we go to Colorado where you just go downhill? So we went to Beaver Creek, and we took lessons, took a lot of lessons, and liked it, and made it then a regular winter activity. And she got quite proficient, where she enjoyed it. Again, the tenacity wanted to become very good, and I wound up to the point where I preferred black diamond mogul skiing. And I was immodestly, I was an excellent skier by the time I quit.
So you were how old when you started skiing?
I was 58 when I first downhill skied.
Wow. And what do you do with most of your time these days?
I am a bridge player. I enjoy playing bridge. I manage my own investments. I do that. I manage all our business affairs, and do a lot of reading, do a lot of walking, try to maintain some physical fitness. And I should say, I spend 6 months a year in Chicago, 6 months a year in Palm Desert, California. Palm Desert, California, I play golf 3 times a week and have a trainer, and I'm much more active there than I am here. Since we've sold our weekend house here, I've got to create a new regimen for myself here.
So with the weekend house here, where was that?
That was in Michiana Shores, just right across Lake Michigan, 68 miles from here. Different world.
And when did you sell that?
June 18th, 2017.
And the place in Palm, did you say
Palm Desert, California.
When did you buy that?
That was bought in 2000, and it's an Indian Ridge Country Club, and an enclosed community. I'm a member of the Indian Ridge Country Club.
When did you have your first grandchild? Roughly.
30 years ago. Well, that would be, 87?
And how many grandchildren do you have?
9.
Do you know all their names?
Yes, I do.
All right, I won't ask you to rattle them all off.
Okay, well, that includes Ruth's 1 grandchild in the 9. Oh, but I mentioned I have my first great-grandchild,
Okay.
who's 2 years old now.
So you have 1 great-grandchild.
1 great-child, yeah.
And how was it, I should say, how was it different having grandchildren than children?
Oh, they're a lot less responsibility. Yeah. No, it's more joy and less concern.
Do you have any hobbies now besides golf
Oh, and bridge,
and bridge?
yeah. Genealogy, yeah. I have a very extensive family tree. I think 1,600 ancestors
Wow.
have been identified.
Wow.
And my Aunt Min, my father's sister, married my mother's brother, tricked me into it. She was the family genealogist. And she said, John, do you ever go to Boston? And I said, yeah, I have business there once in a while. I said, well, could you go out to Belchertown, Massachusetts and look something up for me? And I said, well, yeah, I guess I could take a day and do that. What is it? He said, well, I want to find out who Joel Lee Fairfield's parents were. And I think that's the answer's in the Belchertown Town Hall. Well, turns out the answer wasn't in Belchertown Town Hall. So I started going to the courthouses around and trace, and I took an extra day or two, and I caught, it's detective work. I
Right.
caught the bug. And I know she knew I was going to do that. That was the way she passed the baton. And now I'm trying to figure out how to pass it
Yeah,
to
that's right.
somebody else. I've got a grandchild picked out, I think.
What kind of father do you think you were?
I think I was a good father. I was fair. I probably was overly strict, overly tough with them. But I think I have a very good relationship with them now. I think they would say that I was a good father.
What kind of grandfather do you think you are?
I think I'm, well, 7 out of 9 are showing up for this event. And the two that aren't, one is in a rock band in Germany. Can't really come back from that. And the other one is studying for a PA, taking her final rotation. She just can't get away from it. So I'd say pretty good grandfather.
What was the best time of your life, best period of time?
Oh, right now, the time I'm in, it's, I can think, the time in Arlington Heights in Virginia Terrace was a really joyful time, but I've had a good time my whole life. Strangely enough, I feel best when I'm under strain. I just love stress. I love the adrenaline rush.
What was the worst or hardest time of your life?
4 years in Newark, New Jersey, under a tyrant of a managing partner. I went there thinking he was a rock star, and he turned out to be a bully.
What are you most proud of in your life?
My children.
Any regrets or anything you would have changed about your life?
Oh, it's fun to play roulette with your life, with roads untraveled and so on. But no, I think I've been very fortunate. I somehow or other have gotten to this point in nearly 90 years in very good condition for a guy that's had quadruple bypass and all sorts of other problems. And I wouldn't want to take a chance on some other route. I like the one I took.
What do you think has changed the most in your lifetime in people? How are people different now than they were 50, 60, 70 years ago?
That's a tough question. We're very much more informal, less civil than we were. We're much more intelligent. I'm not sure we're better informed. This blizzard of news we get is not real information. I think when we had to dig it out of the newspapers, it might have been better information. But I think everybody looks at the coming generation and says they're not going to be as good as we were. And I think that we've all been wrong, and I think we'll continue to be wrong about that. I think I'm very optimistic about the progress of our species.
Do you think life was better 70, 80 years ago or now?
Oh, no. No. Life was tough 70, 80 years ago. Now, That's colored by my recollection of the Depression. But even when you weren't in depression, it was tough. You had washboards instead of the machinery that we have now. It just we were primitive compared to what we are.
Do you believe in God?
I'm a deist. I believe that there's a power higher than me that I don't understand. Somehow or other I connect it with, if I could tell the difference between infinity and zero, I would know the answer. But I think instead, I believe, I ask why are we here? And I think the reason we're here is to find out why we're here. Then we'll have the answer.
Let's assume for a minute there is a God and you meet him someday. What do you think he'll say to you?
I think he'll say you did the best you could. You sure screwed up in a few places, but all in all, I'll give you a B+.
And what message do you want to leave for your grandchildren and beyond on how to live a life?
To the fullest. Just enjoy it. Enjoy it even when it's not enjoyable. Just be thankful that you're here, you're still moving. Look at all the people that don't have what you have and go for it.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. That's a real pleasure.